So before we start, I just wanted to kind of go over, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
This is the history mostly ancient slash Robert's group, which is the culture and history, and then we have other group, world history group, and now we also have a philosophy group that joins us, and we all under the same umbrella. So just want to go over a little bit about us. We've been founded 2 years ago, and a lot of the founders are on this call. Paul and then John, Greg is when he's going to join. We started from the beginning 2 years ago, and we had like 5 to 6 people on the call, but now sometimes we get over 100 people, which is testament to our presentations. And today's presentation is going to mark on us kind of going back a little bit, because we started with Mesopotamia, and Akkadian language has to do with the Mesopotamian dynasty, or so to speak. You can even call it a country, or maybe in a small empire, so to speak. And Akkadian language was a lingua franca back in the days, and that's why I've asked today, John Maloney, who is a linguist and had done a really amazing presentation on kind of, you could think of a first real, known poem or writing, Gilgamesh, and had spoken a little bit about the Sumerian language there as well. But it's a completely different language, and that's why I want him to present. So without further ado, I'll press the record button, and John, you go ahead.
Okay. Go away. Yeah, I'm John Maloney. I wrote my thesis on Akkadian language a long time ago. I've been happily studying it ever since. Before I get started, I should always mention this Akkadian has nothing to do with the Akkadian in Quebec. That was a completely different phenomenon, but people are always confusing them. What you see here is the name of the Akkadian language, and then a bit of Akkadian, Akkadu, which was the name of the language. It was written in Cuneiform, which you can see the signs there. I'll explain how Cuneiform works in a little bit. So before I get into the linguistic stuff, I'll give you a quick overview of Akkadian history. In the mid-3rd millennium BC, a strong state emerged in Mesopotamia. Probably its best-known king and its first Sargon was a Semite who spoke Akkadian. His name is Semitic, and I'll explain what Semitic is in a little bit. But Sargon means, in Akkadian, means the true king, which suggests to a lot of people that he was actually a usurper. He knocked off the previous king. Now, Semite is a term that was invented by Western scholars in the 18th century to designate people speaking similar languages of a very distinctive type and having similar cultures in the ancient Near East. The Sem in Semite comes from the 3 sons of Noah in the Bible, Sem, Ham, and Japhet, if you know your Bible. These were considered the ancestors of all humanity by the people who wrote the Bible, and you see the flood wiped everybody else out, so they had a good claim. Now, the term Semite, is really obsolete now, and it's considered somewhat racist and objectionable. The only really current legitimate usage is restricted to the linguistic realm, i.e. the Semitic languages, in the sense that these languages are closely related structurally and are distinctive from other languages. Besides Akkadian, the well-known Semitic languages include Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Ethiopic, and there are well over 100. Now, Sargon's empire, its capital was Akkad, by the way. You can see it on the map right there. The site of Akkad has never been discovered by archaeologists, and that has really hindered understanding of the nature of the empire. We don't know where it was, so that map is somewhat misleading. His empire was Akkadian speaking. Languages, as we know, generally spread as the empire speaking them expands its power and influence. Think of the expansion of the Roman Empire and the way Latin just pushed aside the indigenous languages in what is now Europe. Now, this map gives an idea of the spread of Akkadian political power over time. The heartland was in southern Mesopotamia, just follow the cursor, down towards the Persian Gulf. After Sargon's empire, whoops, always hitting those buttons inadvertently. After Sargon's empire died, the Akkadian people developed into two different regions in Mesopotamia, Syria in the north and Babylonia in the south. Assyria is named after Ashur, who was the Assyrians' principal god in their who was their principal god, and Babylonia in the south. It's named after Babylon, their capital. Babylon itself means gate of the god. In Akkadian, that's Bab Ilam. In Sumerian, it was Ka Dingara. These two dialects, they also developed into different dialects of Akkadian, Assyrian and Babylonian. They really aren't so different, and they were undoubtedly mutually comprehensible. Now, the map shows that at the beginning of the second millennium, Babylonia dominated the region. See the blue line, that's the extent. By 1,000 years later, the Assyrians were in charge. That's the red area you see. There was also a later period, the green line, when Babylon moved back into the lead. And as you might know, the Persians eventually conquered them all, and that brought an end to Akkadian visions of imperial glory. They were one of the first, instances of state formation in the world, and it undoubtedly was connected to the fact that agriculture began in what, archaeologists call the hilly flanks. In Syria, agriculture probably just dropping seed at the beginning was just dropping seeds into a little thing in the ground. You create it with a stick, but that's how it began. It moved down from the mountainous area into Mesopotamia proper, and that's when they got very good at managing water through irrigation, and that's where agriculture began, and it undoubtedly led to the greater capacity for state control, and that created the opportunity for an empire builder like Sargon. It undoubtedly was not a pleasant event for people participating, except for the conquerors, of course. Well, after the empire, after the Akkadian political pretensions were defeated by the Persians, the Akkadian language also began to fade. It ceased being a language the common people spoke at an unknown date. Scribes continued to produce documents in it, but this ended around 200 AD. Its very existence was forgotten. Unlike Egyptian, where hieroglyphics were always visible up to the present on many monuments in the Nile Valley, the clay tablets in which Akkadian was mostly written ended up underground due to the destruction of cities and wars, subsequent construction on top of earlier buildings. Excavations were required to recover the text, and these excavations did not begin systematically till the 19th century. Akkadian just passed out of the consciousness of the West and was completely forgotten. The Greeks, Herodotus knew about the Babylon, but it was really just a name to them. The language itself, though, just really disappeared. When it was finally deciphered, Akkadian turned out to be an East Semitic language. I'll come back to what that means exactly. That was spoken in Mesopotamia from the 3rd millennium BC on, BCE if you prefer. Semitic peoples were moving into Mesopotamia from somewhere. By the way, there is no scholarly consensus on where the Semitic homeland was. The Arabian Peninsula is a traditional choice, and now it could have been further north, even in Syria. It's been suggested it's from Northeast Africa somewhere, but there really is no data on where they came from. The people occupying Mesopotamia that the Akkadians were moving into were the Sumerians. This is a people of very mysterious origins. A lot of people suspect a link to the Indus Valley culture of India. And thing about the Sumerians is they were a settled people. They lived in cities and small villages, as opposed to the largely nomadic Semites. So you had in old-fashioned terms, the more vigorous people moving in onto the settled people, and the more vigorous people came to dominate. As I said, Akkadian then was lucky enough to become a language of empire. Over time, Akkadian became the dominant language of a large part of the Near East. Of course, we don't have numbers of how many speakers of Akkadian there were versus speakers of other languages, but the documents show that Akkadian became the language of government, law, literature, religion, and other functions. How far it supplanted other languages, and there were certainly other languages there at the time, among them a very mysterious one called Amorite and Ugaritic and such languages. How far it supplanted these languages among common people outside of Mesopotamia is not known. So in the first millennium BC, Akkadian sort of started to leave the stage. It was gradually replaced by Aramaic, another Semitic language. Aramaic is mostly extinct today, but there's still a few pockets of it in Syria. Of course, the Aramaic today is very different from, very different from ancient Aramaic. But Aramaic was the bridge between Akkadian and Arabic, yet another Semitic language that became dominant in the Near East starting in the 7th century with the rise of Islam. Now, as I said, Akkadian is named after the city of Akkad, which was the capital of Sargon's empire way back in the 3rd millennium. Since the Sumerians and Akkadians were co-located at the beginning in southern Mesopotamia, there was extensive linguistic mutual influence between them. They are very different languages, but Akkadian borrowed a large number of Sumerian words and was even influenced grammatically. The Semites who moved into Sumerian territory in the 3rd millennium saw Sumerian as the bearer of a high culture. They were literate. The Semites probably were not at the early stages. As I said, the Sumerians actually lived in cities, and the Akkadians became very attracted to Sumerian culture. Over a few centuries, Sumerian ceased to be a language spoken by the common people. It was replaced by Akkadian. We don't know much about the specifics of how that happened, but Sumerian remained as the high language of Akkadian culture for 2,000 years. Now, this is culturally similar to Latin surviving in Europe as it was replaced by the Romance languages as the vernacular. The case of the Japanese who adopted Chinese as their literary language. You read a lot about Japanese nobles would write poetry in Chinese in the medieval period, and they didn't think that Japanese could be used as a literary language. Of course, that's another whole story. But we have, for Sumerian, we have evidence in the form of lexical lists that scribes were expected to be literate in both languages. The teaching materials that were available did not include anything moderns would call a grammar, but in place of that, there were lists of Akkadian and the equivalent Sumerian words. By the way, these lists were of enormous help in deciphering Sumerian, which is a language with no known relatives. Now, recently, as an aside, Simo Papala, he is a Finnish scholar, he's claimed that Sumerian is related to the modern Uralic languages, and that's a group that includes Finnish and Hungarian and languages like that. The term Uralic is based on the Ural Mountains. Uralic languages are widely distributed in Eurasia, think Estonian, Hungarian, Finnish, etc. But they're centered on the Ural Mountains, hence the name. And I must say, I've only looked casually at Papala's evidence for the link between Sumerian and Uralic, but it does seem plausible. As far as the documentary evidence for Akkadian goes, the first occurrence of Akkadian comes in the form of proper names, which were first attested in Sumerian texts from around the mid-3rd millennium BC. Akkadian and Sumerian proper names are very different from each other, so they can be distinguished. Excuse me.
John, I have one question
Yes.
from the chat. Do you mind if I read it to you?
Yeah, please do.
And maybe this is too far ahead, but where does Hebrew fit into all of this?
Oh, I'm coming to that. I think of it as the high point of the presentation. Because Hebrew and Akkadian are, well, I can go ahead and show you. Oh, it's too far ahead here. This is the family tree of Semitic, and you have Hebrew way down at the bottom. Akkadian, the big split in Semitic is between the West Semitic languages and the East Semitic languages. There are only two members of East Semitic, and that's Ebelite and Akkadian. Hebrew is way over here at the bottom node of Northwest Semitic, and Arabic is a sister of Northwest Semitic. And Hebrew is most closely related to Phoenician and Moabite. Phoenician is well known as the language of Carthage and famous traders in the Mediterranean. Moabite was a sister kingdom to Judah in southern Palestine at the time, and it's very close to Hebrew. Anyway, getting ahead of myself there. Anyway, okay, from about the 25th to 24th century BC, texts fully written in Akkadian begin to appear. As I said, by the early second millennium BC, you have two variant forms of the language, Assyrian and Babylonian. In total, hundreds of thousands of texts and text fragments have been excavated, actually well over 1 million, covering a vast textual tradition of mythological narratives, legal texts, scientific works, correspondence, political and military chronicles, and many other examples. Akkadian is a big language in the sense that we have a lot of it. Many other languages where you only have a handful of documents, so you can't understand it very well. To give you one example, I heard a Syriologist once say, and that's a scholar of Akkadian. I'll explain to you why he's called a Syrianologist and not an Akkadologist. That's a problem with the field, but this Assyriologist said it's no longer possible for one person to read all of the Akkadian we had. And that moment came sometime in the 1960s. There's just too much stuff. In fact, a great deal of the Akkadian we have are in museum basements because the field is so tiny that so much stuff has been collected and has started being excavated in the mid-19th century, was accumulated in the basements of places like the British Museum, and they haven't even read all of the stuff they have collected. Well, centuries after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, Akkadian was the native language of the Mesopotamian empires throughout the later Bronze Age, and that's the archaeological term for a period from 3000 to 1000 BC, where the main metal was bronze. As Zach mentioned in the introduction, an interesting feature of Akkadian is that it became the lingua franca of much of the ancient Near East, up to the time of the famous Bronze Age collapse, when everything sort of went to hell in circa 1150 BC for reasons still somewhat unclear, but a great many states just collapsed for a while. In particular, before this collapse, it became the first instance of a diplomatic language where Akkadian came to be used for formal communication between states such as Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and Mitanni. That's a little-known kingdom that's sort of in northern Mesopotamia. The Egyptians even used Akkadian to communicate with their vassal states in Syria and Palestine. They did not use Egyptian with its hieroglyphics. Well, that's unusual because Egypt was the great power. Why didn't they sort of impose Egyptian? Why did they not insist on their official communications being in Egyptian? Well, they didn't. My own opinion is that Egyptian hieroglyphs are just simply too difficult for other cultures to learn. Akkadian, I'll get into this. Akkadian was had a much more efficient. Cuneiform was a much more efficient and easily learned writing system. In fact, Egyptian has hundreds and thousands of symbols, sort of like Chinese, which has thousands of separate systems. It imposes a huge learning burden on people, which is why there's only one case of a culture adopting a ideographic system from another, and that is Japan. I don't know of another case of a writing system that writes in pictures. Logograms is the technical term, adopting it. They love to adopt alphabets and even syllabaries, but not pictographic system. Now, Akkadian became a great cultural language during its run. Hammurabi's law code, the most famous law code in Near Eastern history, and the Gilgamesh epic, the first epic ever committed to clay tablets, were written in Akkadian. Now, Gilgamesh was originally came out of Sumerian culture, but it consisted of disconnected stories about a hero named Gilgamesh who did various brave and noble things. It was only in the Akkadian dominant Old Babylonian period, that's about 1750 BC, that a unified epic was produced, and that we know as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, Akkadian, with the decline, conquest by the Persians, loss of political power, Akkadian began to decline in the first millennium BC during the Neo-Assyrian Empire. By about the 8th century BC, Aramaic, as I said, another Semitic language, began to supplant it. By the Hellenistic period, that's the period when Alexander had conquered most of the Near East, and after his death, it's referred to as the Hellenistic period after 323 BC, I believe. The Akkadian language was largely confined to scholars and priests working in temples in Assyria and Babylonia. And then, as I said, it eventually died out. We, of course, don't know who the last Akkadian scribe was, but definitely a he, I'm afraid, undoubtedly went to his grave cursing the newfangled alphabet that Aramaic used. With a more than 2,000-year tradition of literacy and high culture, the Aramaic scratches must have seemed very vulgar and lowbrow.
Did I hear you say Akkadian was spoken from a third millennium on?
Yeah.
You mean there is evidence of it in writing from that period, and that
Yes.
we know it was spoken widely at the time?
Yes, I'll come back to it. I have a slide on the different periods of Akkadian language, and there are several hundred clay tablets from what's called the third millennium Akkadian is known as Old Akkadian. That's a modern term, but there is documentary evidence for it. We have people write grammars about it. We have a good idea of it. Does that answer your question?
Well, it was Diana asked it, but the question, I guess, follows: who mostly used the Akkadian language? Was it the bureaucracy, or was it widely used? I mean, what was the education kind of?
Well, it was the native language of the people in Mesopotamia. In the non-Mesopotamian parts of the empire, it's unclear how many common people actually would have bothered to learn Akkadian. It certainly was the official. If in this map, if you look at a place like Syria, which the Assyrians had conquered, and down into Palestine, it was used certainly in the occupying troops, the Akkadian troops, maybe not the auxiliaries. And it was used officially, language of law, courts. Merchants probably learned it, because they were doing deals long distance, and merchants tend to be multilingual in every culture. But we just don't know how many common people, non-native speakers of Akkadian, would have learned it. If you were a peasant out in the fields who spoke early, an ancestor of Hebrew at this period, remember we're talking about well before the emergence of Israel, that they probably kept speaking that language and probably knew a few words of Akkadian, but given the nature of states at the time, most people probably had little contact with state agents, except for taxes, I imagine. But so we really just don't know.
Another question before we move on.
Yeah.
So the question states: if we have not read all the Akkadian texts that have so far been discovered, is it possible that other literary works like Gilgamesh are just waiting to be discovered?
Well, Gilgamesh was a unified work. It existed on 12 tablets, but it came to us in fragments. It's unitary for the Akkadians, but for the moderns, it came down in just little scraps lying around. And Syriologists have spent a lot of time. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, putting those pieces together. We have about 2/3 of Gilgamesh. Now, are we finding? We are finding new fragments of Gilgamesh all the time. For example, the opening of the Gilgamesh epic was, the first few lines were unknown until somebody discovered it back in the 90s, I believe, 1990s. And so it was added. So Gilgamesh is constantly growing. As far as the existence of an unknown epic, it's highly unlikely, in my view, that we'll find a new one, because Gilgamesh was mentioned frequently in other Akkadian sources. I'm not aware that there's anything. There are other literary epics. There's the Atrahasis, which is the Babylonian story of the flood, which prefigures the Noah story. in the Bible. There's Ludlow, Baal, Nemeki, I will praise a lot. There's a lot of hymns and prayers that have come down to us, but major works along the lines of Gilgamesh, it seems unlikely. We would have seen a fragment by now. But I could be wrong. So does that answer the question? Or?
Yes, Mark says absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, yes. Okay, where was I? Oh, on cuneiform writing, as far as writing systems go, there are three major types. Logographic focuses on meaning and writes the words, think Chinese. Syllabographic focuses on sounds and writes the syllables, like ma, ba, fa. Alphabetic, it focuses on the sounds, and it writes the consonants and vowels which go to make up syllables in human language. So most, English is an alphabetical system. A syllabic system is Japanese, which, it has a logographic system, but they have a separate, it's called kana, a separate syllable writing system. It has 50 symbols to cover all the possible syllables of Japanese, like Yamamoto, that'll be 4 signs. So, in English, we write it 1, 2, 3, 4, with 8 signs, the Y, the A. In Japanese, they can write it with 4 because they're only writing the syllables. Now, most writing systems are mixtures of logographic and, Akkadian and Sumerian are a mixture of logographic and syllabographic, and I'll show you how. Here's a picture of the overall development of cuneiform. It was originally invented by the Sumerians. There's a few minority voices who think somebody else invented it, but to me, it seems clear it was the Sumerians. In the above picture, you can see the different stages of cuneiform writing. Started out as logographic. See picture head. This is the Sumerian word for head is sang, written there in the English alphabet, means head. It's a picture of a head, and you see the other things going down. Gin is a verb to walk, and that's, it's not directly a picture of the walking act, but it is a picture of something related. You have shu is the word for hand. You get something with 5 digits, and I guess that's supposed to be the thumb. She is the word for barley. You get a barley stalk there. Ninder is bread. I don't know why they think that looked like bread, but it is. Is Sumerian for water. Ud is the word for, that's a sun rising or setting. And the bird symbol is obvious. Now, that's in 3200 BCE. By the way, the system in its origins, most people think that it began with the rise of agriculture. It stored things, and people needed a way to record what they had. So it was used for administrative purposes. So it wasn't really connected to language at the beginning, to making a record of human language. Now, by the turn of the 3rd millennium, these signs were rotated 90 degrees. Nobody really knows why. I'm sure there are many, it's unclear to me. And that, as you can see, over a very long period of time, it just became more schematic and non-representational. Like most of the signs on the right side, by the time you get to 1000, like this sign doesn't remind you of water. Well, the barley one, you can think of that as reminding you of, some sort of grain, maybe. The word for the sign for hand is still could be thought of as a picture of a hand, but managed to lose 1 digit on the way. And it became, by this period, they were totally standardized. In the older periods, you had many different scribal variations on these signs. This is really quite schematic, this picture. Now you can see this writing system lasted 3,000 years. And how did that happen? You can appreciate that scribal schools formed immediately, and they were very good at imposing standards of writing standards. There's a great deal of uniformity in the writing. And they were fiercely conservative, as writing systems tend to be. Look at English spelling. We still spell a lot of our words like they were pronounced 800 years ago. But spelling doesn't change easily. So it exhibits remarkable consistency in the writing traditions over 3,000 years. You can only look at Chinese as the only comparable example and Egyptian in the world for this sort of persistence. Now, during the third millennium, some unknown scribe, this is first grade insight that produced actual writing of human language, realized you could use the sound of the Sumerian word represented by a sign to write instances of that sound. Ka means mouth, could be used to write any syllable ka in any word. This marked the invention of true writing. Scribes could now write all elements of the language, not just concrete objects. They could do verbs, grammatical elements, nouns, abstract nouns, beauty, truth. They could write words like that. It eventually developed into a very complex system of 1,000 signs. Now, soon scribes are busily writing down all sorts of things: contracts, legal documents, poems, myths, royal inscriptions, law codes, etc. By the way, there's a scholarly convention. If you see all caps, that means it's a Sumerian word. The Akkadian is usually written lowercase, just because the texts are mixed, so you want to keep the sources of the signs separate. But now, given a pictorial system as an early Sumer, that's the name of the country for Sumeria, that's a foreign name. The actual native name is Kalam. So how do you produce, to go back to that topic, how do you produce logograms of concepts that aren't easily visualizable? Now, this is the Akkadian scribes doing this. So they're wondering how to, represent truth or beauty. Now, the scribes took advantage of the rebus principle. They used the sign of a word that is homophonous with a verb or abstract noun. The sign gi means reed. It's a picture of a reed. It'll be used for a homonym, gi, truendo, which is a verb. Now, critical here is that when you get to the Akkadian stage, they never gave up the Sumerian logograms. They just read them in an Akkadian way. And now the motivation for the original idea may have been that Sumerian has a large number of homonyms. It's sort of like Chinese, but Chinese has tones. Now, the hypothetical English example, if you use a picture of an ant to write, well, it won't work for my dialect. I say aunt, but a lot of Americans say ant. It would work fine for them to use a picture of an ant used to write aunt. Now, problems with the system, there's polyvalence. The same syllable, as it increased in complexity, the same syllable sha could be written in several different ways. That's produced a lot of difficulty for people deciphering the language. There really is no real explanation. Maybe there was a lack of standardization and individual scribes made their own choices at some point, and it all got folded into the scribal tradition. In reverse, one sign could have many different values. And what you see here, that's the name of the sun god. In Sumerian, that's Utu. That's the second sign there. The sign before it represents a star, and that's a convention in Cuneiform writing called a determinative. It's an indication, hey, a proper name is coming up, and it's the name of a god. So the god is being associated with the shape of a star. And that's a pretty neat idea, actually. But the problem is that sign Utu has many different readings. Utu means sun. It also represents related concept. Ud means day, because the sun is up during the day. It can also represent, these are Sumerian words again, baba. It can also be white and shining, associated with day. And it can also be going from white, shining to pure. It can also be zalag. With no help, you just have to recognize it in context. Now, syllabograms is when this logogram is read with just a phonetic value. And here, this is a big Akkadian problem because it had the values ud, ut, tam, ta, sa, tu, pia, pa. Some are phonetically related, that makes sense, but others have no relationship at all. Tam, ta, pia, and it just happened. I mean, they weren't very efficient in deploying the system. Now, there are four types of individual signs in Akkadian. They devised a mixed system of signs, structurally similar, as I mentioned, it's structurally similar to the Japanese system, both logographic and syllabographic. They use logograms from Sumerian, beer. Sumerian was a beer culture, by the way, not a wine culture. Kash meant beer, and Lugal meant king in Sumerian. Lu is just man, Gal is big, so it's big man. Now, in Akkadian, this would be read as Shikarum, meaning beer, or Sharum, meaning king. But they use exactly the same signs, with a different style, but it was the same sign. Now, syllabograms, an original Sumerian logogram was read with its Sumerian sign value, but used phonetically for any syllable. In Sumerian, she is a logogram meaning Bali. In Akkadian, she is a syllabogram used in any word. You write the word to break. That's the infinitive of the verb break, sheberu. See the she in first position. My slides are jumping all over the place. Shepu is foot, nothing to do with Bali, but they're just using it phonetically. Of course, and I mentioned it before, the Akkadians would also use the logogram she to mean Bali. They also borrowed the word for it into Akkadian. So in addition to those two basic types, I also have two other types of signs. One is phonetic complement. This is where Akkadian scribes would use a Sumerian logogram, like Dumu is the Sumerian word for sun, and they would stick a suffix on it, ya, which means my, doesn't occur in Sumerian, and they would read this as Maruya, my son, because Maru was the Akkadian word for son. See how the game works? So you have a sort of a layered system where you have all these formerly Sumerian logograms running around being used by the Akkadians, but they're squeezing in their own grammar into the logogram. Now there's another one, determinatives. I mentioned them before. They stand in front or behind words, and they give a clue as to what kind of thing it is. And Dinga is a Sumerian word meaning God, and you'll get Dinga before many divine names. So that's the system. Basically, there are lots of details I don't have time to go into.
John, we have a question.
Yes.
So do we know if the medium of the Akkadian scribes changed over time? That's the first question. Perhaps the changes, the glyphs, could be partly ascribed as to efficiency changes with the use of the slightly different tools, such as a different stylus or clay or a different material tablet.
The writing was predominantly on clay tablets. They did do monumental inscriptions on stone. The Hammurabi's lock code is on a diorite stela, and the style is different. They had an ornate style. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but if you look at Hammurabi's lock code, it consists of a introductory section that praises Shamash, the great god, and outlines the great virtues of Hammurabi the king, and that's in an archaic style. But the actual law code, and this is an example in this slide, is written in a more everyday style. So it does vary by genre to a large extent, and the signs they don't look that different depending on medium. If you can recognize one on clay, you could probably recognize it on stone, but it's not very different. Did that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. Here's an example of the famous Hammurabi's law code. You can see the how it works. On the left, the first thing you see is what scholars call the transliteration. That's a sign by sign. There's shum, there's the ma, there's the ah, there's the we, and there's the lum. You note there are no word divisions here. What's interesting though, they wrote on line tablets. They would draw lines so they could keep keep everything nice and horizontal, but they never broke a word across a line. That I'm not saying it never happened, but it was not the custom. So you get shumma awilum. That's if a man. They didn't have an indefinite article, so it's literally if man. But you only get it. You only have whole words. Shumma awilum awilam. There's another whole word, one, and they fill out the line too. You notice. yeah, if you look at this, you can see what they're doing is that they could squeeze in 3 words into the first line. And I've sort of transliterated this incorrectly here. Wilam here is on the second line, but he realized he couldn't fit a Wilam in this longer word, Ubirma, into the third line, into the second line. So he spread out the signs for Wilam, and you ended up with just one word on the third line. So you can see, so they had style. They had rules for how to do this, and they obeyed them. That's transliteration, sign by sign. Here's what's called the normalization. This is really what modern scholars think it sounded like, because Akkadian cuneiform wasn't, I'll come back to that, but it wasn't a very good match for the language. Sumerian and Akkadian were very different. So there's things like vowel length. They had long vowels and short vowels that are only minimally indicated in the actual writing system. There's no indication that this I is long or short in the writing system. Scholars think it was, and there's a lot of evidence for it. And this is a normalization of Shema Wilam, God. Ubema netam elishu edima la tinshu mebishu idak. And you can read the translation. This is the basic law code. Each section of the code is structured as an if-then statement. You get the statement, the facts of the case, as the lawyers would put it. If a man accuses a man, denounces a man and accuses him of murder and has not proved his guilt, then you get through that whole if clause, and they can get quite long. I picked a short example to fit on the slide. And then you get the judgment. His denouncer shall be killed. Mubishu idak. A lot of these laws end with idak, shall be killed. It's not a merciful law code by our standards. So that was writing. Now back to what was the Akkadian language actually like? Akkadian is an inflectional language. That is, it has fairly simple word structure. It's not agglutinative. Some languages like Inuit, what used to be known as Eskimo, they'll squeeze a whole lot, and Turkish, they'll squeeze a whole lot of information into one word. But the one word in Inuit can be equivalent semantically to a sentence in English. But an inflectional language is in between. It changes the endings or beginnings of words to indicate grammatical function. And here's an example here. Ina Kashadia on a Bekali, and that is on my arrival at the palace gate. It consists of Ina, a preposition, at, upon, Kashadia, verbal noun meaning arrival with the genitive case ending I, first person suffix ya. Another preposition, Ana to, Bob, noun, gate. By the way, Bob is the same word in Arabic. That's, there's thousands of cases like that. Arabic and Hebrew will match Akkadian in terms of vocabulary. That's how we know they're related. And Akali is a word for palace. That's a Sumerian loan word into Akkadian. It comes from Egal, the Sumerian form. It means big house, which they thought sort of like big man, big house is kind of primitive back then. Okay, now looking at this, it might seem very alien to English, but if you look at it at a deeper level, you can see that it has many parallels. The Akkadian preposition ina corresponds to an English preposition with a similar meaning. The preposition also precedes the noun as it does in English. Kashadia is a verbal noun expressing arrival with the suffix ya. Here's the difference with English. In English, my, the equivalent of ya, is a separate word. Ina is attached in Akkadian. The expression ana babe kale is a prepositional phrase beginning with the preposition ana, corresponds to the English at or to. Babe kale is a construction that literally translated means the gate of the palace. Akkadian, like Latin and say Russian, doesn't have a definite article. I mean, a lot of languages think it's a waste of time to have any kind of article. Latin, they don't say a man, the man, they say man. But I put it as the palace gate in English. English I could have translated as the gate of the palace, but that sounded a little bit clumsy in English, so I made it the palace gate. And I point out these parallels between English and Akkadian to show Akkadian and English share a lot at the structural level, and it's Semitic and English is an Indo-European language, Akkadian is a Semitic language, or this type of argument, you could think that they might have been related at some deep well back towards 10,000 BC. They may have been related. And that's it. Other languages in the world can be much, much farther from English than Akkadian.
John, there's
Yes.
a question.
Yes.
Two questions, actually. Would you be able to explain the difference between linear A and linear B?
Oh, yeah. Well, linear B was discovered at Mykonos. It has nothing to do with Semitic, by the way. It's a famous story of it was an early form of Greek, the oldest form of Greek we have, very different from Attic Greek, which was the language of Plato and Socrates. But it was spoken in Crete, and linear B was deciphered. A famous story. Michael Ventris, the architect, who was an amateur, not an archaeologist, not a linguist. He just studied the patterning of the signs. He made an assumption that it was a form of Greek, and it turned out to be correct. Linear A, as far as I know, has never been deciphered. They were culturally related, but and the major reason it hasn't been deciphered that there isn't a whole lot of linear A. It helps to have a lot of examples. It helps to have related languages. It helps to have bilingual texts. You have a translation. The most famous example of that in the ancient world is the Darius's inscription at Behistun, which is in Old Persian, Elamite, and Middle Babylonian. And when I come to the decipherment, that inscription was one of the bases of the decipherment of Akkadian, because you knew what it said you could already read Old Persian. Elamite is still not very well known, but it was used to basically they could match up place names in the inscription and start deriving sign values from that. So basically linear A and linear B are quite different. There's a very good book on the decipherment of linear B by Margalit Fox. It just came out about 5 years ago, and it's a good story because it's a sad story because the person who had the best chance to decipher linear B was a classicist. And it's sad, but her name escapes me. But she died. She was working hard on it. She died at 41 of cancer. And then Michael Ventris came along and redid a lot of her work and got all the credit. But it was just a sad case. But it was that's the situation. So it really has not much to do with Akkadian. Okay. Now, cuneiform in other languages, Akkadian cuneiform was very high status in the Near East. It had immense cultural influence on other Near Eastern powers in mid to late second millennium. As I mentioned, Akkadian language became the international language for interpower communication. Much like French in the 18th century in Europe, all the diplomats spoke French. And nowadays, they all speak English. I just saw an EU press conference in which the lingua franca was English, and all these non-native speakers of English were all chatting away in very good English. It's rather odd that they're sort of stuck with English, even after England, left. They're sort of stuck with English because the learning burden of learning something new is too high. They have so much investment in English. But anyway, back to the second millennium. Akkadian cuneiform was also used, other people adopted it, the Hittites, the Hurrians, the Elamites. Curiously, the Egyptians did not. They probably had they were the big dog formerly. They were the ancient empire, and they were well aware of their antiquity. The culture extends back to 3000 BC. And they never, aside from the Amarna letters, they never took over, never wrote anything in Egyptian. And why it happened, why we have the Amarna letters, I'll be coming back to that. Why we have some Akkadian written presumably by Egyptian scribes is unknown. Now, is cuneiform a good writing system? This is where I get to express my opinions. Bad things, syllabaries contain more signs than alphabets. English has 26 letters plus a set of other things like currency indicators, symbols like the dollar sign. those are logograms. You know, you're writing a whole word with one sign. You aren't writing sound either, because the dollar sign can be used for various words. Now, the Akkadian, as I said, the total sign inventory is up towards 1,000, but the signs in use in any one period are much lower. You can read old Babylonian texts adequately with approximately 200 signs, syllabograms and logograms. Now, over time, the scribes increased the inventory of signs, particularly in things like reading omens. But, you know, I won't call it scientific, but technical areas like the ancient Babylonians were very fond of forecasting their future through omens. You know, they would study cow entrails and things like that. And the number of signs, you know, they just added signs over time, and which it's an interesting things about writing when you have a small cast of people who are responsible for all your written productions, and you know, literacy was minute in the ancient world. Even the nobles couldn't read, very many of them, in ancient Mesopotamia. It seems to become, you make the writing system so complex that only a professional can use it, because it's even true in Egypt. Egypt has the image of being all hieroglyphics and thousands of signs, but it started out with a perfectly good consonantal alphabet. It just got more complicated over time. But polyvalence is a problem. You know, the one sign can have many different readings. And more fundamentally, Sumerian writing is not a good fit for Akkadian phonetically. I won't go into that. But like, you couldn't distinguish, Sumerian didn't distinguish T and D, K and G at the end of a syllable. Akkadian did. What's surprising is the Akkadians never tried to fix the problem. You know, they just left it like that. So, you know, it didn't impact the usefulness of these. The Sumerian shortcomings vis-a-vis Akkadian phonology didn't impact communication enough for them to make any fundamental changes, apparently. Second slide, good things. Truly ideographic systems like Chinese have thousands of signs. Akkadian, as I said, has a much smaller inventory. For the most part, Akkadian, in ordinary language like letters, it doesn't use too many logograms. It's restricted to nouns in Old Babylonian for the most part. In later periods, they do include verbs. Now, as should have become clear, this creates two possibilities of writing many items. And here comes a big typo. The Sumerian ma equals sun. It's actually dumu in Sumerian. I fell asleep, I guess. You can write the same item either logographically or syllabically, either one sign meaning sun or two signs meaning sun. So another good possibility is, you know, other writing system. Another good point about Akkadians, other writing systems in the Near East, like Arabic and Hebrew, they never wrote the vowels. And we can talk about why that may be the case. In the earliest period, they didn't write vowels. It was added in a capability. At least Akkadian always wrote the vowels. It made our understanding of that language is so strong, is very strong, because we can see what the vowels were in addition to the consonants. And in Semitic languages, the vowels are very important for grammatical understanding. That's how grammatical concepts are expressed. There's a language like Ugaritic, which is language of a small city-state on the Mediterranean. They have a strictly consonantal alphabet, so their writing system has inhibited a lot of understanding of the language. I already did part of this. Let's see what I haven't covered. You have the split between East and West, and as you go down the tree, each branching point represents further splits between languages that occur over time. These splits typically occur when there's a population movement and there's no longer communication between groups, and then language change happens. So once the language, you know, once you had a unitary language, it splits into multiple languages. So Semitic languages and other language families offer a challenge to this model of language change. As the Semitic peoples, they occupied a relatively small area with not many insuperable natural barriers. You know, they had rivers, not too many mountains in the Near East, except in Syria and places like that. There was always a lot of contact between the different languages. So, for example, Arabic, which somehow is assigned to Central Semitic, which is a group of 3 language families: Arabic, Old South Arabian, that's an inscriptional language from the Yemeni area in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, and Northwest Semitic. Northwest Semitic has many daughter languages. This is only a sample. Northwest Semitic goes down to Canaanite, and Hebrew is an offshoot of Canaanite. Now, Canaanite is, I'm going to come back to that. That's unattested. Well, it's attested in a very interesting way. We have documents that seem to contain Canaanite. But anyway, Arabic is associated now with Central Semitic. It used to be associated with languages like Ethiopic. The tree would look somewhat different, but the problem with Arabic, it's so morphologically rich. It shares features with all the other languages. Every distinctive feature in another language, Arabic has a talent for having. It's really quite remarkable. Now, a striking feature of Akkadian is by an early date, Old Babylonian period, early 2nd millennium BC, 1800, 1700, it had lost all the guttural sounds found in a language like Arabic to this day. These are sounds made in the throat by the action of larynx and pharynx, of the larynx and the pharynx, and they're considered the phonetic hallmark of the Semitic language family. Now, this fact that Akkadian lost all those sounds, and you can read them in an Arabic newspaper or hear them in Arabic media today, indicate that a lot of Sumerians learned Akkadian, since Sumerians did not have these sounds. And generally, in a situation where adults are trying to learn a second language, hard features such as unusual sounds that aren't found in many other languages in the world are frequently dropped. This is somewhat speculative, as we don't have much information on how native Sumerians learned Akkadian. Some did. How many did, we don't know, but the Sumerian did die out. And in their acquisition of Akkadian, they may have had a deep influence on the language. Another indicator is Akkadian is very unusual in Semitic. It puts the verb at the end of the sentence. Like we say in English, the man kicked the ball. Subject, verb, object, and you know what the relative role, is depending on of the man and the ball is their position with respect to the verb. If you come before, you're the subject, the one doing the kicking. If you come after, you're the one being kicked. Akkadian doesn't do it that way. They say the man, the ball, kicked. So it's a subject, object, verb. That's what I mean by verb final. There's another language in the Ethiopian family, Amharic, which is the national language of Ethiopia, which is verb final as well, but it's very, very unusual in Semitic. Usually Semitic, in Arabic and Hebrew, they begin with the verb. Kicked the man the ball. That's how, in the standard, there are variations, but the main ordering type is verb, subject, object. So we know that it seems highly likely that Sumerian was verb final. I forgot an essential fact. Sumerian was also verb final, so it seems highly likely that the Sumerian speakers turned Akkadian from a verb initial, like the other Semitic languages, into a verb final language. So there's evidence of, there was a lot of what linguists call contact phenomena, is that Sumerian and Akkadian were mixed up for many centuries, spoken by the same people, and they just had influences on each other. Sumerian, in the end, was the loser. Unfortunately, it just died out as a common language. Now, here are the different periods of Akkadian, the different dialects. Excuse the quality of the graphic. It's the best I could find on the web. Thank God for the web. But what you have is Proto-Old Akkadian in 3000. That's hypothetical. We don't have any texts of that, really. Then 2400, we start to get texts all in Akkadian. By the way, all these names in these charts, these are modern scholarly conventions. The Akkadians didn't have such terms. And so on. You can see Assyrian and Babylonian are the two major dialect areas, both with an Old, Middle, and Neo. There's a little, Babylonian gets a late. That reflects the Babylonian kingdom as being the last gasp of, Akkadian political power before the Persians took over. But there's also a poetic dialect starting out in the Old Akkadian period with its own forms, and it turns into something scholars call Standard Babylonian. The great Gilgamesh epic is written in Standard Babylonian. Now, Akkadian, during this development, during this whole period of time, Akkadian changed. For example, it exhibits a phenomenon known from the development of Latin. Akkadian uses case endings to indicate the role of a noun in the sentence, as in Latin or Greek. Over time, these case endings disappeared. Universally in languages, it's a fact the ends of words tend to be lost in speech. People don't like to pronounce whole words, particularly when you have a strong stress, on an earlier syllables. It happens again and again in languages. These case endings disappeared. Now, from a cultural standpoint, Old Babylonian, right there, did become the classical stage of the language as it was associated with the powerful Hammurabi dynasty of the 17th, 18th centuries. This was long remembered as the Golden Age. This is a common phenomenon in languages with high culture. Later, Akkadian writers tried to imitate the Old Babylonian dialect. That's what produced Standard Babylonian over here. It was sort of an imitation of Old Babylonian with differences. This is very similar to what Latin writers in Renaissance Europe did when they tried to imitate the classical Latin writers like Cicero and Julius Caesar. So Babylonians, they may not have had names for the dialects that you see on the screen. They did have a sense of linguistic history. They could look back and see a style, see a dialect they admired and tried to imitate it. And, the language that Hammurabi spoke was good enough for these scribes to try to write like him. Of course, he was illiterate. He never wrote anything. He had scribes. But, an interesting fact, Hammurabi was the best known Akkadian king, but he wasn't actually Akkadian. He came from a little known group called the Amorites. And we know that. I mean, there's no text that says Hammurabi was a Akkadian, but his name contains a sound that is foreign to Akkadians. So I don't have it. I can't, it's not on the slide, but the initial sound, that H in Hammurabi, actually represents a sound not present in Akkadian. And so it proves that he was a non-Akkadian stock. It probably an Amorite raider managed to move in and create the first dynasty of Babylon. But we do have some kind of handle of the linguistic complexities of the period. There's even a case of a forgery where a later writer tried to make a legal document look older than it actually was. That gives you a good idea of the depth of our knowledge of Akkadian, but you can do that. You can detect such efforts to backdate documents, if I can put it that way, by finding features that didn't occur in the period it purports to come from. And in Renaissance Europe, there was the famous case of the donation of Constantine, that sort of everything was ceded to the Pope by Constantine, and it was a Renaissance scholar, I think it was Lorenzo Valla, proved that it was a forgery in the same way. It had linguistic features that were contemporary. They didn't come from the period that it purported to come from. But there's an example from Mesopotamia of the same sort. Now, there's a terminological problem with the name Akkadian. The name of the language is Akkadu. That's the native name. That's what they called it. If you happen to look into modern dictionaries of Akkadian, you will discover that the major dictionary of the language produced by the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, which is still a going concern, it's called the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. This always puzzles students. The dictionary project, which began in the 1920s, was only completed in 2011. It was one of those, like the OED, Eternal Dictionary Production Schemes. This one was relatively brief. It was only 90 years. And the compiler stuck with the original name all the way through. The reason for this is the first sources excavated in the 19th century were Assyrian. And this was at Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. It was right on the Tigris. Babylonian sources came later, but the name of the language had stuck by that point. scholars realized that there were Babylonian sources, and they realized they needed a cover term for the whole language, and that was Akkadian, named after Sargon's capital. But the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary people never changed the name. I guess it was for branding purposes or something. But it is a problem. As far as the decipherment goes, I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. The Akkadian language began to be rediscovered when Carsten Niebuhr, in 1767, a Dane, was able to make extensive copies of cuneiform texts and publish them in Denmark. The deciphering of the text started immediately, and bilinguals, in particular, Darius's inscription, as I mentioned, were very important. And since the text contained several royal and place names, isolated signs could be identified and were presented in 1802 by Georg Friedrich Grotefend. That's the gentleman on the left up there. By this time, it was already evident that Akkadian was a Semitic language, and the lexical similarities were striking. The word for God is il. In Hebrew, it's el. In Arabic, it's Allah. Elahun is divinity. The word for 1,000 is alf. In Hebrew, it's elif. In Arabic, it's alf. So there were hundreds and thousands of direct. Semitic languages fairly. They're fairly closely related languages. So the similarities are obvious. It's not like Indo-European is a much more widely dispersed language family, and words that are historically the same can look very, very different. I think the famous case among linguists was it was uncertain that Armenian was an Indo-European language because it had so much Persian influence in culture and vocabulary in the Persian period that just looked very non-Indo-European, but it was proven to be Indo-European. People produced sound laws that you could, ordinary Indo-European number word like duo in Latin was actually the same word as the Armenian erku, which means two, and neither word has any sound in common, but it does turn out they are related. But in Akkadian, the similarities tend to be obvious.
So when they were deciphering Hittite language, which is, I hate to say, I may not know this, but probably Semitic language. I don't know that.
It's Indo-European.
Yeah, it's Indo-European, sorry.
Oh, yes.
So when they were deciphering, they didn't know, obviously, a lot of the words, and obviously they used, German, Latin, whatever languages they could use in the European languages to decipher it. And when they were looking at the sentence, they would say, okay, I ate bread, and what does it follow eating bread? And drank water.
That was a famous moment in Hittitology where, and eating the bread, you see how these cultures get so intertwined. The Hittites borrowed, I have a little information on that at the end. The Hittites borrowed their cuneiform system from the Akkadian. So they actually, in that particular expression, the scribe used the Sumerian logogram for bread, ninda. That's how they knew that at the time, they didn't know what the Hittite word for bread actually was, but they knew that sign represented bread. It was only later, you can only get the phonetics of a word by seeing the syllabic rendering of it. You can't get it from the logogram. And what happened was, and they had this mix, just like Akkadian, a mix of logograms and syllabograms. So the expression was to eat bread and drink. And the next signs were wata'a, which was, it was water. By accident, the Hittite word for water looks a lot like English, and they knew they had an Indo-European language on their hands because it's unlikely for such a basic word to be borrowed. And that's sort of got the ball running. You must have read that somewhere, Zach, because it's a famous. It was a Czech, Hrozny, who deciphered Hittite back in 1916. I guess he had time on his hands during World War I.
Thank you. Yeah.
But no, it was good. It's just it must have blown him away when he just saw. And the Hittites were using the Akkadian values of those syllabic signs. They borrowed it. Wata'a. And well. I want to talk about the Amarna period a bit. This is a particular aspect of Akkadian linguistic history, which is it's a very interesting turn in the 14th century BC, when, as I've said, it became essentially a lingua franca for communication between states. The Amarna letters are an archive of 382 letters. There aren't a whole lot of them. They're written on clay tablets, primarily consisting of diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian administration and their vassals in Canaan and Amuru, that was the region close to Cana, and also with correspondence with neighboring kingdom leaders. There was correspondence between the Egyptian state and the Hittite state, which was the rising power at the time. The Egyptians were long established. Now the letters were found in Upper Egypt at El Amarna. That's the modern name for the ancient Egyptian capital of Akkad, founded by the famous monotheist pharaoh Akhenaten. The letters date from the 1350s to the 1330s BC. It was a pretty tight window of about 20 years. And this was during the 18th dynasty of Egypt. The Amarna letters, as I mentioned, are unusual in Egyptological research because they are mostly written in Akkadian rather than that of ancient Egypt. The language used, and I'll come back to that, has sometimes been characterized as a mixed language. It has elements of Canaanite and Akkadian. The written correspondence spans a period of at most 30 years. Now, if you go back, what we're talking about here is previously Canaanite had no real documentation. This was, just looking at the similarities between Hebrew, Phoenician, and Moabite, people could reconstruct a very shadowy entity called Canaanite. But with the Amarna letters, you got actual attestation of things that, given the time depth, 1300 BC, they could be, there we are. They could be evidence for Canaanite. Now, these letters are of great significance, not just for Semitic linguistics and the nature of Canaanite. They're very important for biblical studies because they shed light on the culture and language of the Canaanite peoples in this time period. The land of Canaan, if you recall, is where the Israelites escaping from Egyptian bondage settled after the Exodus, as we know from the Bible. And that's typically dated as in the 14th century BC now, the same time as when the Amarna letters were created. Now, some of the letters, though written in Akkadian, as I said, are heavily colored by the mother tongue of their writers, who probably spoke an early form of Canaanite, among others. Let's see if I can pronounce this, these Canaanitisms provide valuable insights into the prehistory of Hebrew, the language of the Bible. These documents could contain evidence of the language that became evolved into Hebrew several centuries later. It was quite a remarkable find. Now, there's also something I personally always found fascinating about the Amarna documents. Some indeed don't show too much contamination from the native language of the scribes. Some of them are written in good, correct Babylonian, and the ones between states tend to be good Akkadian, if I can call it that. The others show relatively weak knowledge of Akkadian, dialect being Babylonian. Now, the nature of this bad Akkadian, whether it presents just a kind of written language concocted by scribes and never spoken or written, or whether it was indeed spoken, at least by the scribes, has not been conclusively settled. Now, the historical background to all of this is by the 14th century BC, the Egyptian Empire was dominating the Levant up to the borders of the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni, farther north. This was an age of turbulence and disorder in the Levant. Another dominant power was rising, as I mentioned, the Hittites in Anatolia, and they had their own ambitions for the Levant. Within the Levant, power struggles erupted among the local city chieftains and between leading personalities of individual cities. Now, Egypt was a dominant power, so all of these were vassal states, tributary states to Egypt at the time. And all of this stuff is recounted in the Amarna. A lot of the letters consist of vassal kings writing and complaining back to the Egyptian state about conditions in in their areas. They beg for more troops and resources. Now, what's fascinating about this, there's a word that's used to describe a group of people called the Habiru in Akkadian, in the Amarna letters. These were some kind of class of outsiders, and this further, they seem to have been fomenting rebellion against Egyptian rule, and they were encouraging diverse populations to join them against their own leaders. Now, Habiru are frequently mentioned in the Amarna letters, and it's always in a very pejorative way. Now, the Amarna tablets were discovered in 1887, accidentally by somebody plowing a field, I believe. And ever since, the identity of the Habiru has been one of the most fascinating and vexing issues in ancient Near Eastern history. The first scholars to look at the tablets noticed the strong similarity with, could be shocking, with Ivri, Hebrew, the Hebrew word for Hebrew, a name found in the Bible for the Israelites. And it works phonetically. It's a good match. The cuneiform sign, the Akkadian cuneiform sign, cha, would have been a convenient way to write that initial letter ayin in the Hebrew, because Akkadian had lost that sound, so they had to pick the closest sound, which turns out to be a kind of H. And there are other attestations of Akkadian's cha sign being used for that sound, ayin. Now, the other factor supporting the identification is the Amarna period overlaps with the period in which the biblical account has the Israelites escaping from Egypt in the Exodus. That's nowadays, as I said, thought to be around 1300. So Amarna text 1350 to 1330, the Exodus sometimes around 1300. So is there a connection? Short answer is nobody knows. But it is quite, the strength of the phonetic match is so strong that it's quite interesting. Now, the Habiru were frequently referred to in the Amarna tablets. Remember, these are vassal kings being attacked by the Habiru and their allies, the people rebelling against Egypt. They're frequently referred to in the Amarna tablets as sagas. And Amarna texts were written in Akkadian, but they had frequent Sumerian logograms. Sagas is a Sumerian logogram with the meaning robber or outlaw. Now, that's very interesting and a potential description of what became the Ivriim, the Hebrews. Now, the animus is understandable because these guys were attacking their system, their cities. In fact, one Habiru person, identified as an Habiru, became a king of a city-state of his own called Alalak. So some of them were quite successful. So it seems it's not an ethnic designator. Habiru seems to describe a social class of outlaws, mercenaries, and slaves leading a marginal and sometimes lawless existence on the fringes of settled society. Habiru had no common ethnic affiliations, no common language. Their personal names were most frequently West Semitic. They also have East Semitic names, Hurrian, or even Indo-European. There may have been a number of mercenaries in this group. But anyway, they were opposed to Egyptian rule. But there is a problem here. In the Bible, Hebrew is definitely an ethnic designator, name of an ethnic group, the Hebrews, who we know as the Jews. Habiru, as I said, seems to be a social classification of some sort. It doesn't refer to ethnicity. Now, you can make the jump. There's the case of the Vandals in European history. An ethnic term for a Germanic tribe became a pejorative one. The Vandals were a Germanic tribe that invaded the Roman Empire. At the time, it was just an ethnic designation. But in the course of their travels through the empire, the term Vandal acquired highly negative connotations among non-Vandals, and it lasts to this day in English. A Vandal has a specific meaning, and it's not ethnic at all. So you can't have such a switch in meaning, but in the case of Ivri, it'd have to go in the opposite direction, from term of opprobrium to ethnic designated, and that does happen. Maybe you all can help me with examples. I thought of Yankee. It's a word for Americans. It seems to have started out as an insult, but the people so designated took it for their own. Originally, I looked at Wikipedia yesterday. It tells me the most likely source for Yankee is the Dutch form Janneken, which is a diminutive of Jan, a Dutch first name. In other words, Janneken works sort of like Tommy in referring to British soldiers. Just use a name, a common first name to designate the group. Now, such words can be used in a neutral and a pejorative, and they can switch back and forth. In the case of Janneken, again, as Wikipedia informs me, it was likely used by English speakers in their interactions with the Dutch after the British conquered New York in 1664. Somehow, it got transferred to English speakers. At some point, you could use Janneken to refer to English speakers, not Dutch. We do know for a fact Yankee was used as a pejorative by the British soldiers during the Revolutionary War. The Yankee Doodle song, it was written and sung by the British, was meant to be insulting. In fact, called it macaroni. Macaroni was an 18th century term for high style. It was ridiculing the ignorant and bumpkin Americans for pretending to be stylish. So it was pejorative. But then Americans turned around and took it up as a badge of honor. In fact, the Yankee Doodle song is the state song of Connecticut. I have to say these name changes can be quite striking. I remember I'm Irish from Boston, and I was brought up to think of the Yankees as this, the Lowells and the Cabots as this, dominant alien hostile force. And I was amazed. I moved to Texas and lived there for several years, and I discovered that down there, they thought everybody north of the Mason-Dixon line was a Yankee, which was a shock to me. But anyway, you can see how this works. Pejorative words can become terms of art, can become the opposite. Now, there's something similar here happened with Habiru, from a term of abuse to the name of a proud people that lasts to this day. It's a mystery. I myself have no strong opinions on the subject, but many scholars are strongly in support of the link, some very reputable ones, while others are not. For me, however, the evidence is just too murky. It is fascinating to consider, though, that the origins of the people called the Hebrews may be illuminated by cuneiform texts written by Canaanite scribes in bad Akkadian. So anyway, that's all. There's another side I could go into. It's not directly related to Akkadian, but I can go into it. A reinterpretation of the Exodus in the light of new information. But that's all I have now. Are there any questions?
Yes, John, I will unmute people. Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question, except obviously for our regulars. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody. First of all, this was really amazing. Paul, go ahead. Talk.
Yeah, John, I got a couple of questions. First, on the Assyrian Dictionary, University of Chicago, I know that the discipline is called Assyriology.
Yes.
Is that the same thing? It's a bigger term and refers to all people that study Mesopotamia?
No, there are Sumerologists too. Assyriologists are people who are specialized in Akkadian. Other people who specialize in Sumerian, and they're Sumerologists, and some people do both.
But Assyriologists would include people that study Babylon.
Yes, very much so. There's no usage of the best name for the language is Akkadian, but that has not turned into a scholarly field. Akkadology does not occur.
Second question. You were speculating on why the Egyptians were not more aggressive in trying to coerce people into using their writing system. Is it possible that that has religious grounds? My understanding is that the Egyptians saw their hieroglyphics as being highly religious symbols and artistic symbols, and they might have felt it would profane them in the same way that the Egyptians would take wives from other countries, but would never give Egyptian women out to be wives to foreign kings.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's very good. I had a year of Egyptian in grad school. It never lost the hierarchical, hieratic religious use, and it never lost the aesthetic appeal. They worked very hard arranging the signs in the proper way. Now that did, in later centuries, they did develop more practical forms of Egyptian writing, demotic and things like that. But back in the Amarna period, all you had was the monumental, I think. So that may have been a barrier the Egyptian may not have wanted. Well, they perceived Akkadian Cuneiform as just a practical language, just a practical writing system to be used for.
Are you familiar with the historian Jan Osman?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I mean, he contends, well, he basically says that the act of writing Egyptian hieroglyphics was a form of prayer.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't think of that. Thank you.
Are there any crossovers between how Egyptian scribes were raised into this their field, their occupation, with the Akkadian scribes? As far as I'm aware, Egyptian scribes were treated very favorably and were viewed as high status and so on. What's the story with the Akkadian scribes?
I'm not aware of information. They must have been, most of the nobility, aristocracy, if I can use those words, were illiterate. We know that because one of them, Assurbanipal in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, brags extensively about how he can read tablets of the time before the flood, which suggests that his peers could not. So they were in close proximity to the aristocracy, and then there was very little literacy outside of the palace. The nobles would dictate letters, for example, to the scribes, because we know that because all the letters begin. It's quite consistent with the whole history of the language. Speak to so and so, thus me. They'll give their name, and then the scribe would presumably be taking dictation. We don't have any direct information on the social status of the scribes. We do know they were formed into schools. We have evidence of exercise tablets. They would write. They learned to be a scribe by writing all the students would write the same thing, and we have multiple copies, and some of them are filled with mistakes. So it's likely that these were scribal students. We never located, I'm somewhat out of touch, but at the time I was in touch, that no archaeological site of a school had been located that could be identified as a school. I'm not aware, scribes are not named. There's only one great exception, Sinlaiki Unini, which was a scribe responsible for either composing Gilgamesh or producing a famous copy of it. He is named. Apart from that, and that name, his name means seen, accept my prayer, Laki Uneni. Apart from that, I'm not aware of it, that there is any social information about scribes. All the scribes in Amarna, for example, are anonymous. We don't know, were there scribes from hire, for hire, who were trained in a Babylonian school, and then they go to Egypt and get a job with the Egyptian administration to write Akkadian text? Were these Egyptian scribes who learned Akkadian? It seems that the farmers are the more likely, but we don't actually have any evidence who these people were.
Tantalizing. Yeah, it seems ripe for discovery. So thank you very much.
Anytime.
So John, when I was studying this as an undergraduate, they talk a lot about Babylonian scribal culture, and it was a unit of, and they, I think they say that there was a first expansion of tribal culture when in Sumerian under Uruk in the fourth millennium, and then in the third millennium they trace a dissemination of what they call the Babylonian tribal culture throughout the greater Near East.
Well, it had to. The system had to, so many states were using the cuneiform system. It had to be supported somehow. We just don't have any information on how the dissemination worked. I may be personally ignorant.
The thing that was most remarkable to me, you mentioned the lexical lists, the word lists. and which are a list of common words in Sumerian. And the amazing thing to me was that archaeologists have found word lists separated by 1,000 or 1,500 years, and the word lists are identical.
Yeah, they
Word
were.
lists written by Sumerians are identical with things written 1,500 years after Sumerian had become a dead language, and the sequence was exactly the same through that entire
Yeah,
period.
that's very insightful. They were an amazingly conservative culture over thousands of years. Only China, I think, China and Egypt compare, and China is still with us. But things change unconsciously, though. Scribes can think they're holding on to something, but their everyday language will infiltrate and change things. Classical Chinese can't be read by modern Chinese without a great deal of training. But yeah, the world moved very, very slowly back then.
John, I have a question. When you were doing a thesis for Akkadian language, did you have to actually go to like any of the cool museums and sit down and go through some of the stelas and maybe like do some cool stuff in like Iraq?
No, I was not. Assyriology, there are archaeologists and there are philologists, and they don't really like each other very much. But there's a famous story about the people who excavated the Hittite, first excavated the Hittite tablets as Hattusas. The philologist and the head philologist and archaeologist were not on speaking terms, so the archaeologist would just have his team pile the tablets outside the philologist's tent every day, and they never spoke. But more seriously, no, I did not do much. It's a layered approach. Usually when a tablet is discovered, nobody can sight read it. It has to be carefully studied. You don't read it like a newspaper. And the person will find an Akkadian letter and will publish a version of it in transcription, what I showed you earlier. It'll give you both the transliteration and the normalization. And they usually include pictures of the original tablets, because those are just damn hard to read. On something like grammar, works with those limitations, because it's not like a modern language. Everything is, one text you can read, you can think you're getting 98% of all the content that a native person would read. You go to the next text, you don't get anything. It's really quite painful. It's not for the faint of heart. So when you're doing anything higher, the average Assyriologist, they see a few tablets, but not that many. And I was in linguistics, so I didn't care about the tablets that much.
I see. Interesting.
In fact, I did a lot of what the topic I worked on was on Old Babylonian letters, which is probably the central corpus in the language for modern scholars. It's the most important and the most studied. So I did deal with problems of reading, but since a lot of people had written on these documents, I just compared them to each other.
Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Thank you very much, John. This was I learned things. This was a good thing to add on to current knowledge. Mike, you mentioned the for what it was called the Great Collapse, the Bronze Age collapse, 1170 roughly. Could you expand upon that in the fall of Akkadian?
Yeah, Akkadian did just fine as far as I know, but the Bronze Age collapse was something in the Western Mediterranean. Some of you, Paul, you might know more than I do. I'm not a historian, but it was just waves of attacks on the established states by people like the Hyksos, who took over Egypt for a while. They may have been Habiru. Did I read that correctly?
As I understand it, there are like 3 families of theories about the Bronze Age collapse. And one of them, the one you mentioned, is the invasion of the Sea Peoples, hostile migrations of people associated with the destruction of capitals throughout mainland Greece and Anatolia and the Levant. Then the second theory, and they get from small to big. So the second theory is of a social kind of class warfare almost, that they discover that in the destructions of cities, they find that the citadel, the Acropolis, was destroyed, but the surrounding city was not. And from that, they speculate that there was an uprising by the popular people who burned down the Acropolis, but didn't burn down their own homes. And the third biggest macro theory involves climate change.
Yes, I've seen that.
And in other words, a drying out, which reduced agricultural productivity and increased poverty, and therefore created a lot of hungry, desperate people. And scholars such as Mario Liverani, an Italian historian, basically say the truth is probably all of them. That probably there was climate change, probably that led to social disorder from hungry people being suppressed by a rich aristocracy that wasn't willing to give up any of their perks, leading to migrations of desperate people.
Paul, do you mind repeating the name of that Italian historian?
Mario Liverani, Liverani.
Liverani, thank you.
He's got some translations into English. Most of his stuff is in Italian, but he's been translated mostly by Mark van der Meerup, who is an Assyriologist at Columbia, who I had the great good fortune to take some classes with.
You know, there is a question here in the chat about was the biblical Hebrew different from contemporary? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I know a fair amount. It's similar in some ways, different in others. Biblical Hebrew was an inflectional language, so they used suffixes and prefixes much more than modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew resembles Western European language. In the morphology, the structure of verbs and nouns, modern Hebrew is quite close to biblical Hebrew. The major difference, we only have about 8,000 words of biblical Hebrew as attested in the Bible and many, many inscriptions. But modern Hebrew has become a big modern language. It has tens of thousands of words that the ancient Hebrews didn't know about. A lot of loan words from English in particular that they're using now. The big difference in my mind is in the syntax. The Hebrew uses, ancient Hebrew, biblical Hebrew uses the verbs in very idiosyncratic ways. If the imperfect, the future tense the way it's put by non-linguists, the future tense can be used to express the past tense and vice versa. And that's sort of connected with, the past tense expressing the future is connected with the prophetic nature of a lot of the Hebrew writings. So it can be explained linguistically. Modern Hebrew has done away with that completely. It has the old perfected became a past tense, the old imperfected became a future modeled after modern European languages. They invented a present tense, which biblical Hebrew, classical biblical Hebrew really didn't have by using the participle. And so they remodeled the verbal system to look much more modern. And there are arguments over how that I saw the claim recently that by an Israeli scholar that modern Hebrew was a revived language. It had been a dead language, a language of scholarship for many centuries. I've often wondered how well medieval rabbis could write Hebrew well. I've often wondered how well they could speak it. I'm not too learned in that area in medieval Hebrew, but I've wondered about that. But it was revived. The people who revived it were predominantly native Yiddish speakers from Central and Eastern Europe. And it's been claimed that Yiddish had a great deal of influence on modern Hebrew. In fact, it's been claimed that essentially modern Hebrew is Yiddish, where Yiddish vocabulary has been largely replaced by Hebrew vocabulary. So they took ancient Hebrew words and reused them in different ways. For example, chashmal is the Hebrew word, modern Hebrew word for electricity. in biblical Hebrew, it existed, but it was only used to describe the lights coming off of Ezekiel's chariot, some sort of divide. But they reused it as Arabic does similar things too. But morphologically, they look very similar. Yiktol in modern Hebrew, he will kill. It looks the same in biblical Hebrew. It's in the syntax. Biblical Hebrew also, they use suffix pronouns a lot. He killed me, the knee would be attached directly to the verb. They don't do much of that in modern Hebrew. It's more analytic, as linguists say. They use separate words for different things. So it's not like English and Old English, where Old English is incomprehensible to modern English speakers. It's more like modern English and Middle English. We can read Chaucer. If we have the words that the strange words defined at the bottom of the page, we can make sense of Chaucer, but you need special training to really understand it. But I hope I didn't go on too long. But
yeah, John, just follow the question, and I'm really curious. What are the earliest Hebrew writings in existence that you're aware of?
The famous one, up until the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest Bible manuscript in existence was from about 1000 AD, which is quite late. It's called the Leningrad Codex. It's become the standard edition of the Hebrew Bible for all scholarly work. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered.
Is it in Hebrew or
it's
Aramaic?
in Hebrew.
Okay.
Hebrew. Well, the Bible is 98% Hebrew, but there are portions of the book of Daniel and Ezra that are in Aramaic. By the time the Bible got put together, the Jews were so bilingual between Hebrew and Aramaic, they didn't bother to translate the Aramaic. If the original source was in Aramaic, they left it in there. So if you read the book of Daniel, you're going along in English, and all of a sudden it switches without any announcements, which is quite peculiar when you think about it. It must be a combination of the sacred text could not be translated. It could have been that feeling. It might have been they were just the people who were editing the text were so bilingual that it didn't occur to them that it was necessary to translate. So,
but the earliest was
that,
1000.
The Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea
BC?
Scrolls, which date from 1st century AD. That's
Right.
the largest collection of Hebrew material.
But the earliest.
No, there's a lot of old inscriptions. Some of them predate. Well, it's a complicated question because the Bible, as they say in source criticism, it's a tapestry of different documents. So the oldest Hebrew are things found in the Bible, just stuck in amidst Hebrew from later stages. The famous one is Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, which is written in a very archaic form of Hebrew, which is generally dated to about 1000 BC, but it's part of the Bible. We also have a lot of inscriptions, which I don't know much about personally. But the oldest Hebrew, Song of the Sea, Song of Deborah, other parts of the Bible, there's a Song of Moses that scholars, one of my teachers, Frank Moore-Cross and David Friedman, sort of established that they were, within the Bible, there were some very old Hebrew texts just added in somehow. So I hope.
There's a book by John Deaver, who's an archaeologist, and in it he talks about, and it was not his discovery, but he talks about the discovery, I believe, in Sinai of and what they call an ancient Hebrew inscription, and I think they dated as far back as 1000 BC.
Yeah, that's the usual date for the
and in it, it describes the god Yahweh as having a wife, Asherah. And so they wrote
that's true.
So
I just read
that's the earliest that I've read of attested occurrence of Hebrew.
Yeah, 1000 BC is the date I know. I just read an interesting book on the Exodus by Richard Friedman. He's a biblical scholar. And he mentions a transition. He dates the transition to monotheism way back to the time of the Exodus or even earlier. But he says it probably took time for the rabbis, the priests, I should say, at that period, to convince the Jewish common people to give up their belief in gods. So there are all these traces of polytheism that occur particularly early in the book of Genesis. You know, there's a mention of the sons of the gods and the daughters of men, and the sons of the gods, and using the plural, are very attractive to the daughters of men. There are several different weird things like that that indicate that polytheism survived for an unknown period of time until it was finally stamped out in the Jewish community. Friedman dates the Friedman. It's always interesting. The Exodus happened around the time of Akhenaten, the famous pharaoh who worshipped the sun discs and seemed to deny the existence of other gods. But that's not completely true. It happened about the same time. So he speculates there may have been a group of Jews who became Jews who were very attracted to that monotheism, and they adopted Yahweh as the God. And at the later date, and one thing Friedman says, he does not think that there was a massive movement of Hebrews from Egypt to Canaan. It's much more likely it was a much smaller group that escaped slavery and made it back to their homeland, the land of Canaan. And a lot of the Hebrews, or pre-Hebrews, I should say, in Canaan would have remained there. And they had always, the ancient god was always El. It's the word for God. They worshipped El, but they also worshipped other gods. But the escapees from Egypt may have come in. They may have been Egyptian. This is what's odd, because Moses, it's well known as an Egyptian name. And it may have been more precise than that, is that there were 7 other Egyptian names around the Exodus tale, Pinchas, and they were all Levites. Moses is identified as coming, his father was a Levite, the priestly class. It may have been a case where high status Egyptians, they may have descended from people from the land of Canaan who came to Egypt, but they may have been heavily Egyptianized. And so when they got back to Canaan, they were able to convince the Jews, the Hebrews who had stayed there, to adopt monotheism. And that would explain the problem of all the different names for God in the early parts of the Bible. You have El, you have Elohim, you have Yahweh, which is the name that can't be mentioned, of course. It's always Adonai, my Lord. May have been why there was an equation of Yahweh with El, and that's when monotheism began. The idea of a universal God that is not a force of nature, that is above nature. And it's also exclusive. There are no other gods. So, but anyway, that's his speculation.
John, what about the other speculation? Since I believe Exodus, at least not historical event, more of a kind of mythological. But what about the idea that one of the tribes, which were Hebrew tribes of Canaanite tribes, had their main god, that they decided that that's the only one, and then as they maybe mingle or dominated other neighbors, they kind of enforced that god as the only god. But certainly Akhenaten, ideas might have disseminated and influenced.
Yeah, it's much more believable that the first thing he says is archaeologists have never found any physical evidence for mass movement of people from the Egyptian Delta back to Canaan. And so they sort of decided that the Exodus could not have happened. Well, Friedman makes the obvious point that, it must have been a much smaller group that made the move. The biblical, I think the Bible says in the Exodus narrative that over 600,000 Hebrew males accompanied Moses, and that would add up to 2 million people, including the women and children. And there's no mention of the Exodus in any Egyptian source. But if it was a much smaller group that escaped a difficult situation, then that makes much more sense. And if they were highly educated Egyptian Egyptianized Jews who made it back to Canaan to escape their situation in Egypt, they could have had a great deal of impact on the population that had remained there.
Comment on that? I think it's important to point out that there is zero archaeological evidence for the Exodus.
Yeah, there's zero, but he explains that. I found the case, so I recommend the book. It's called The Exodus by Richard Friedman, F-R-I-E-D. It's a quick read, and he's quite convincing. He's been top
There
level.
could be a
biblical-
small group, could be small groups,
Yeah.
you know, that obviously it cannot be, yeah.
Can I just ask?
And
There are
then
a
many.
few different. There are a
Yeah.
few different Richard Friedmans. Is
Yeah.
that we talking about Richard Elliott Friedman?
Yes,
or-
him. Yeah, he's a good biblical scholar. He likes to write popular books, though, and this was a good one. I found it persuasive. I mean,
he's written. This is a really interesting book
yeah,
called The Bible with Sources Revealed, which is where he basically, it's his own translation of the Bible, which is a very, very good colloquial English translation. In it, he uses a different typeface and different colors to indicate what he believes are the different sources.
yeah,
I mean, I think it's widely acknowledged by scholars that there are different sources, but precisely where the divisions are subject to discussion. So this is a really fascinating book because you can read, if you read just the sections from one source, it's more coherent than the Bible itself is, because the Bible has multiple stories of the same events with many contradictory details.
yes.
But what the other interesting book is this one, which is Israel Finkelstein. And he talks a lot about the same area that you were talking about of the origin of the Hebrew people, the Israelite people. And he says that the evidence that he says that the majority of the Hebrew people were Canaanites. And he acknowledges the possibility that you suggested of a very, very small number of people who may have escaped from Egypt and had some intellectual or religious influence on that group, but it's purely speculative theory.
Yes.
But what he does point to as hard evidence is that there are some technologies that were used by Iron Age Israelites that could not have been developed overnight and were common Canaanite agricultural technologies. He talks about terrace agriculture and the use of watertight cisterns to store water. And that these were key, that you could not have survived in the Judean hills without these technologies that would make agriculture more productive in a place that was intrinsically not productive. And that these are the main points. And he had one more, which I can't remember at this moment, which to him are the strong evidence that the real origin of the Israelites were people who basically escaped from the lowland Canaanite cities during times of famine and political oppression associated with famine. Also,
Friedman has
monotheism. There's a theory, and once again, I was looking in my bookshelves, and I know I have it, but I can't find it. Theory that I found really attractive is that monotheism developed as a faction within the Israelite court during the Israelite Northern Kingdom, and that it is associated with the prophets. That the prophets' constant polemics against polytheism, which was actually represented by people like the king of Israel, Ahab and Jeroboam and people like that, was actually a factional position of them trying to put over monotheism and claim that it was historical when in fact it was one faction among many. And he furthermore credits the ability of the what became the Jews to avoid assimilation during the Babylonian exile, to the fact that in this previous period of factional politics in the Kingdom of Israel, that this group had developed an ability to be anti-assimilationist and to basically reject polytheistic culture, and that had existed for a few hundred years before the Babylonian exile. And that was when that was the context in which these people who were trained to avoid assimilation, associated with a monotheistic view, became the dominant view in what became Judaism. And furthermore, he says that the Torah, if you will, was the propaganda document of that faction.
Yeah, monotheism. I read an interesting. There's an interesting book called Weird. I don't know if you know it. It's about how the West diverged from the rest of the world, and monotheism may have been a means. It does. It's the ancient pagan gods were not moral at all. Zeus did whatever he wanted. It didn't much matter. If he hated you, he caused bad things to happen to you. Monotheism and the Jews really introduced moral religion. And when you think about it, that's a really good means of social control. You get people to feel guilty about not doing their duty, for example, and people who have to live up to moral. And monotheism is this book sort of develops the idea that it's really, another step to increasing control by the state within human societies. I mean, it's quite interesting. So,
well, I mean, that's kind of a cynical top-down view, but also,
well, that's a social science view.
It also is something that promotes group solidarity.
Yes, precisely. I forgot that.
Right. So that's an important
how to mobilize people, being monotheistic, worship of one God.
You look at
instill strong
the Islamic conquest, and you can see, which really reads very similar to the biblical story of the Israelite conquest of Canaan.
Well, I did read this. This is all speculative, but it's all fun. I did read a book where the claim was that the book of Joshua is considered genocidal. Well, this biblical scholar claimed it never happened. What happened was in later centuries, the Jews became very obsessed with racial purity. So they could never admit that they had intermarried extensively with other Canaanite tribes. So they just eliminated them in the official propaganda.
Sure.
They just killed them all. But in fact, it never happened. And there is no archaeological evidence for violent conquest either. There is no layer of burnt.
Another theory that I found extremely interesting, which was associated with the ideas of ethnogenesis. In other words, question of how does a tribe come about? The idea that a tribe or people who are related from a common ancestor is actually a fiction, absolutely untrue. But it's used as a means of promoting social cohesion. And then he talks about the Jewish patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as being a typical example of a patriarch of three different tribes that confederate and then create a story about how their respective patriarchs were actually related to each other, and they put them in order and create kind of like a pantheon or a genealogy, which then becomes the founding myth of the new combined tribe.
That's all highly believable.
All right, let me just see if anybody else also have a question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I see. I hope.
Is Mark has his hand up still?
Mark, is still on? Oh no.
No, sorry, I didn't lower it from before. My apologies.
Anybody else have any questions related to the Akkadian language or the presentation today?
Just want to say, John, thank you so much for this. I really learned a tremendous amount.
Thank you.
Really interesting to me. And I'll never miss one of your presentations.
Same here, by the way.
Thank you.
Same here, John. They really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I try to put on a show, gentlemen.
You succeeded as far as I'm concerned.
Excellent presentation. So John, I guess we'll talk more if you're interested in coming back. You see the audience is very engaging and
Yeah, I can do dead languages forever. The only good language is a dead language.
Maybe we
Okay.
should do. I'm so fascinated with Sumerian language because maybe I'm not saying like you've said that it connected to the Indian culture and particularly maybe Dravidian. I don't know. I'm just saying.
Well, they had Sumerians had a myth about coming from the east. I think it hangs by a very thin thread. And since the Indus Valley civilization had a writing system, but it hasn't been deciphered, so we don't know how much information on. But I can do presentations on Egyptian, Ugaritic, Hittite, what have you.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Some of them,
I love it all.
Yeah, at least,
I can do it from a linguistic perspective on most of them. Like I've never studied Hittite, but I know how to understand grammars and things. So
yeah, I mean, let's talk, and I could at least once a month, we could do something like that.
yeah.
Interested, obviously people are engaging and love it, and Ugaritic to me, it's like, I mean, is a part of Semitic.
Yeah.
It's not that far from Hebrew.
Yeah.
Actually, the exact classification of Ugaritic has always been controversial. Some people would say.
Yeah, want to say Hittite is very interesting. I've been to Ankara Archaeological Museum, and unfortunately, whatever I've seen there from Hittite culture, it was like so damaged. I mean, like so little and so damaged. So it was like not much, unfortunately, left from it in terms of statues, and so I was a little disappointed. But maybe there is more. So it's interesting, actually, to also see if there are any more historical or archaeological objects along with history of it. Yeah.
Excellent. So on that note, John, again, excellent presentation. Thank you, and everybody enjoy the good weather today, and thanks for everybody to join also in this good weather, right? The amazing weather. Just want to talk about our upcoming events, if you don't mind, just 1-2 seconds. I apologize for taking up people's time for this, but kind of do a little bit of advertisements here. So tonight we're gonna have Neo-Taoism, which is part of our Jason Indian versus Chinese philosophy. So we're doing philosophies on, and it's a discussion, right? I mean, Greg participated in Roman and the Greek philosophy, which was, incredible. So Jason and his friends do a presentation of Indian and Chinese and Roman and Greek philosophy. We're on Socrates right now. We've finished with Socrates. We're going to Plato and so forth, so on. So that's going to be on Monday, but today we have Asian philosophy at 7. Then tomorrow, if you're interested, we have our own, Dr. Sabil Ahmed, who is part of Anti-Defamation League, Islamic Anti-Defamation League, will do a presentation on Islamic guidance for social issues at 12 p.m. tomorrow. So if you're interested, join us. Should be over 200 people on. So he's a very renowned. You can look him up on Google. He's actually a physician by trade, but he's also a cleric, Islamic cleric, and we're doing this religious tolerance thing, which I'll have Rabbi at some point as well. Then I said Monday we're gonna have Plato's Just State, which is a Greek or Roman philosophy. We have history combined with philosophy, which is really great because we have discussions, open discussions. Then on Thursday next week, Richard is doing World War I Middle East Theater Part 2. So we're doing everything, Armenian genocide, Ottoman Empire, creation of Turkey, Entente. It's amazing. I mean, you can look up on our YouTube channels called History of Fitness Investing, and all 40 or somewhat sessions from Richard is there. And on 8/7, if you're interested, Jane is going to do Mary, Queen of Scots, which is August 7th. And so join us for anybody who's interested. And she is doing a Powerful Women event. So at some point we'll do Hatshepsut. But right now we're Powerful Women, Mary, Queen of Scots. We already did Elizabeth. We did Catherine II of Russia. So all these interesting events. So join us, whenever I can, whoever is interested, drop off any kind of links you need. And hope everybody has a nice evening. John, amazing presentation.
Thank you.
One more thing, I found that book I was looking for, so I just want to show this book. Palestinian Parties and Politics That Shaped the Old Testament by Morton Smith, Columbia professor, written in 1971. Towards the end, he kind of goes off the deep end, at least I think, but the first 3/4 of the book are absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much. And Petty just asked, is it possible to pop into Asian philosophy session without having done previous ones? Yes, we explain every concept for, whether it's related to India or Chinese philosophy, or, recently we were explaining the concept of in Roman and, Plato's writing, which is called Meno and all that stuff. We have picturesque. So a kind of interesting philosophy, history type of combination. So do join us. Can you please post the YouTube link in this meetup comment afterwards? Let me just do that right now. So any kind of other miscellaneous stuff you guys want to talk, and then I will keep you posted on John's next event. So whether John wants to do Sumerian language, kind of be in line, or maybe we can move on and do
Sumerian, yeah.
Babylon, Assyrian, whatever you like. I mean, the court is in your boat. The ball's in your court. We love anything and everything.
I would be interested in Hittite. I think, Assyrian is kind of continuation of Akkadian. I don't know if much more could be added there, maybe. But Hittite, interesting. Sumerian, yeah, it's a mystery.
So yeah,
One of the things I always found most attractive about Akkadian was it's relatively well known. Sumerian is not so well understood because, as I said, it's a language isolate. It's a difficult language, so you really have to struggle with it. There are cases. I remember one scholar wrote an article and said, I don't know whether this text is in the first person or the third person, which that never happens with Akkadian.
John, do you have any familiarity with Hurrian?
A little bit. I've looked at it long ago, so that's another weird language.
I've always been fascinated by the Mitanni and their introduction of the war chariot and the importation of that from Indo-European speakers in the mountains.
They also had Indo-European deities in their pantheon, I believe.
Exactly, which emerged from discovery of treaties between the Hittites and the Mitanni that were mentioned gods from the Vedas.
Yeah, because they had Vedic names.
So I have a particular interest in that if you ever want to talk about the Hurrians.
Well, that may be a bridge too far since I've never actually studied it.
I don't think that there is all that much to study.
But
what
about Mitanni? They're also Indo-European, right? As
Hittites. No. Mitanni are the Hurrian speakers.
They're Hurrians. Right?
Yeah, for some reason, the kingdom was called Mitanni. The language was called Hurrian.
Right, and the Mitanni,
I don't know why, actually.
Late development. There were Hurrians politically active in the ancient Near East who essentially coalesced into the Mitanni kingdom. But the Hurrians, the Mitanni was a kind of a late name given to the emergence of a state to the king.
Right.
One thing I'm fascinated with, John, regarding the languages. They said when the Bible was written in the original language in Hebrew and Old Hebrew up there, the things that they wrote was so much more glamorous, like a Big Bang, for example. Is there a concept of the fact that when translation came to be, there was completely kind of like subdued translation, so to speak? I just remember back in the days and learning, taking advanced ancient literature in college. John?
I'm not quite sure I understand. I mean, the
No, so for
literary quality of the Hebrew writings is at a very high, it's considered very high now. There's been a lot of work on literary appreciation of the Bible in the last 40 years, as represented by Robert Alter. He's the great literary Hebrew scholar. I mean, it's considered a very high style, and on the other hand, there are periods where things get pretty dull and prosaic. So,
right.
Exodus is like the most important book in the Bible. The Exodus was the greatest event in Jewish history. That's most consequential event in Jewish history, and the style of the book matches it. One thing, Friedman, it's very tightly written, very carefully considered. Like he points out at one point in Genesis, the mention of other gods besides Yahweh occur up to the Tower of Babel episode. Then they drop off and disappear. And he's thinking that that's when the peoples of the world, it was not so much, Tower of Babel was not so much an act of hubris. It was God sort of splitting up one people into many peoples and assigning them languages, separate languages. And that's when polytheism kind of disappeared. I mean, it's speculative on his part, but he says it's very carefully written. It wasn't random.
I've always, we know you mentioned the Babylonian creation myth, and we have, the flood myth in Gilgamesh. So clearly these stories circulated widely in the ancient Near East for millennia before the Bible existed, before the sources of the Bible existed. And one thing that I've always noted is that rather than thinking of these things as being original stories that the writers of the Bible came up with, now we know that they're not. What's more interesting to me is that they show a specific editorial point of view on existing stories. So, for example, in Genesis, they say God created man in his own image. That's absent from any of the other versions of these stories. The idea of a special relationship, that there's a divine streak in man, which is kind of a central concept of Judean Christian tradition, is almost like an editorial comment on the Babylonian and Sumerian myths, where in the Gilgamesh myth of the flood, the reason that the gods brought on the flood is because they were annoyed by the buzzing sound that the human beings made.
They were too noisy. At the time I read it, I had a noisy neighbor, so I understood the god's reaction exactly.
Saying, okay, human beings are ants. Let's just blow them away because they bother us. And then after they did that, they go, oh my God, no one is now bringing us offerings. No one is making sacrifices. What are we going to do?
I wonder if the ancients ever read that as comic. I mean, it sounds comic to us, but did they have?
But then the authors of the Torah then kind of created this notion of history, in the sense of that there's a purpose, there's a direction, where all of these previous religions were very cyclical. There was no notion that there was a plan, that it was going somewhere, but the idea that God says, I am going to give this land to you and you will be my people. So there becomes a historical concept injected into religious thinking, which also is a contribution of the Hebrews. My speculation, which is not very more than just my intuition.
Also, Amarna letters. When Egyptian, when other kings were writing to Egypt, they were asking for gold. A lot of it was about gold, like send me more gold.
Yes,
I think it was Anatan was the pharaoh at the time, and obviously, and it was just all this complaining. How was a diplomatic language? Akkadian was a diplomatic language, and they were writing to Egypt to ask, almost begging, give me more stuff. So it was just kind of funny almost, Babylon, Assyrians, all these people writing, but it's a diplomatic language, right? I mean, even right now, if you look at Lavrov, right, the Russian minister talking in English, he's using a very, high level English, even though he's basically saying, we're here, we're invading Ukraine and everybody shut up, but it's still used in a kind of diplomatic fashion. Obviously, he's doing the bad thing, but in any case, so how was it how diplomatic was the language, this Akkadian language? And
well, I did allude to that. The actual intrastate communication between the Hittites and the Egyptians, the Egyptians and Mitanni, was quite good Middle Babylonian. They used high quality scribes. It's the other letters from the vassals, the Egyptian vassals to Egypt, that where you get the sense that the control of standard Akkadian, and it was standardized because in Mesopotamia, all the letters look remarkably similar over a wide territory. So that implies they had school and they imposed standards. But by the time you get to southern Palestine, where you had the little vassal kings writing to the pharaoh or to the administrators, and all they did was whine too. It's very funny reading, actually, the Amarna letters, because there was one character, Rib Hardy, who just sounds so neurotic, but he was always complaining about being overrun by the Habiru, and it's a good read. But it's in really bad Akkadian, and that's linguistically, that's fascinating, because it's the only evidence we have of a written Proto-Canaanite, the ancestor to Hebrew, and it's of course it's quite controversial how to interpret those things, but it all came from, badly trained scribes who couldn't write properly. And it makes sense that between states you would have a better paid scribes, you'd get better quality, but these little kinglets, probably not so much, but we don't have any information on that.
So Professor Van der Meerup writes about this, and he calls it the Club of the Great Powers, which is the overall term that he uses for the late Bronze Age. And basically what he's saying is that when you read these letters, there are two types of addresses. Either you're addressing your brother, which basically identifies the writer as being one of the great kings.
It was carefully coded, you're right.
And there were a very small number of them. They were Egypt, they were the Hittites, they were Babylonia, they were initially the Mitanni, and then the Mitanni were essentially wiped out by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians assumed the role as being one of the great powers, which the Babylonians strongly objected to and constantly said, no. These Assyrians, they're because the Assyrians were actually a threat to them. And I think the fifth was the king of Cyprus. And the convention, Zach, was that they were brothers and they were exchanging gifts. So and there's a lot of scholarly research in which they say that this was really a very key part of the ancient economy, even though it was described as being the gift exchange between kings. And that's the context in which particularly the king of Babylon is complaining to his brother, the king of Egypt, that, why don't you send me more gold? Your streets are made of gold. It's for you, it's like dust, But the comment is in the context of them talking about gifts to each other and the devotion and the love that brothers have to each other. So that kind of covers up the reality and the Egyptians had gold mines in the Sinai, and other peoples didn't have access to gold in the same way that the Egyptians did.
Yeah, Assyriologists always hate Egyptologists too, because Egypt got all the gold, and Akkad was a mud culture. So people don't pay any attention to it.
Van der Meerup is interesting since he is qualified both as an Assyriologist.
That's very unusual.
And as an Egyptologist. He teaches the Egyptian history. I know I met somebody that was studying Egyptian hieroglyphs under Van der Meerup.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That is very unusual, because usually Akkadian Assyriology is within the orbit of biblical studies. because Akkadian contributes a lot to the understanding of biblical Hebrew, along with Ugaritic. Ugaritic actually, their myths and epics, resemble Old Testament themes quite a bit. So Ugaritic is very important to biblical scholars, but Egypt is a different universe from that. There's not too much.
I mean, biblical archaeology, for example, is kind of a problematic term. I mean, just the very word biblical archaeology demonstrates that it's tendentious.
Yeah, it's been dropped to a large extent in the field, but it was up until about 40 years ago, it was the name of the field. And you're right, it is tendentious.
It's still all over YouTube, for example.
Really?
And there are publications from the Institute of Biblical Archaeology, and it always is, they're always trying to prove that the Bible is true. And you can see their agenda is just totally transparent.
Although the top level scholars have gotten much more sophisticated, it's not so much the Bible is true, but the Bible is consistent with what we know of ancient history of the period. For example, the patriarchal narratives don't mention camels. Well, the camel wasn't domesticated until after that period. Right. So they always talk about donkeys and stuff like that. The stories aren't necessarily true, but the cultural background is.
So, for example, they talk about Abraham coming from Ur of the Chaldees, but the Chaldeans didn't actually appear in Mesopotamia until hundreds of years after supposedly Abraham existed.
I often wondered about that. So it's just an anachronism.
The Chaldees came with the Aramaeans.
They were an Aramaic tribe. I don't think much is known about them.
And they say that they emerged, in following the Bronze Age collapse, and when the curtain kind of lifts on the Iron Age, you see Chaldees in southern Mesopotamia and Aramaic speakers in northern Mesopotamia and Syria.
Yeah, but I think the whole idea, and I don't mean to offend the religious people, the whole idea about the origin of Abraham probably came during the Babylonian captivity. It's probably this whole idea came to mind because they've seen the Babylonian cultural supremacy and the achievement. I think. That's my speculation.
Yeah, a lot of people think you're right, Greg, that lots of things we think are old in the Bible are actually late. The Babylonian captivity was the 6th century BC, and so everything is sort of a back formation from the concerns of that period. A lot of other people, though, think that the patriarchal narratives, although they were probably written in the 8th or 9th century, and they reflect a situation several centuries earlier, so there's no consensus on that.
Yeah, but the question is the origin, where the Abraham came from.
Yeah.
I think there's a sense that the earliest composed elements of the Bible are the prophets, that the prophets were historical. And as I said, with that other theory of the people who were the prophets representing a political faction pushing monotheism. But it seems like certainly that the Torah was edited in Babylon.
Oh, it's extensively. Yeah, I mean, it's mentioned in the Bible. I mean,
the Bible then says that that Ezra returned from Babylon with the Torah in his hand.
Yes.
But the stories that what are identified as the J source and the E source predate the Babylonian exile. So that would tend to indicate that the stories of Abraham predate the Babylonian exile.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Friedman in his book, when he's discussing his methodology, he sort of makes a claim, well, all these things are sort of like fairy tales, but in Cinderella, the magic pumpkin is obviously fictitious. I hope I don't offend anybody, as Greg said, but her crystal shoes are not. So the goal of the scholar is to find out what's real from what is fictitious. There are, as in the story of Exodus, I believe something like that happened. It became a national myth. But I do think there's enough evidence to feel positive about the probability of there being some movement of people, maybe a small number from Egypt to Canaan. That's you know.
But it's purely a speculation.
Well, there's evidence.
Yeah, but at least if there is a small number, then you can never prove it archaeologically.
That's true. Yeah.
It was the idea, you know. But then, as a myth develops, it became grand, you know. And the same thing, by the way, about the stories about Abraham that maybe predate Babylonian activity. It doesn't mean that all stories about Abraham predated.
That's true.
And
Absolutely.
the origin, and the origin story could have been
these
added
stories
during the Babylonian captivity.
And
These
you'll
stories-
notice that the Bible, these Abraham stories talk about the Hittites. And
Well, they aren't the historical Hittites. I mean, that's the
well, the
Hittim and
name
then
is there, right? And
Uriah the Hittite.
I'm saying, but you know, whenever when they say that when Abraham was first showed up in Palestine and negotiated to buy the cave of Machpelah,
Right.
you know, that the people that he was talking with were Hittites and Hivites and a bunch of others, and the name Hittites was known exclusively from the Bible until the archaeological discovery of Hattusis.
Right, but Uriah was at the time when Hittites already were non-existent.
That's
I mean,
right. That's right. So somehow there's a
in
memory.
the time of David, right?
So somehow there's a memory that's conserved in the Bible just of their name.
Yeah.
One comment on Richard Elliott Friedman.
Yes.
I'm a member of a Reform synagogue, and our rabbi is a really fabulous scholar. Really, I have a very high opinion of him. And I was in a Torah study group with him in which we would read from 5 or 6 different translations, going around the table in each reading, and we would see how much of a gray line there is between interpretation and translation. And we would keep going back to the Hebrew, and since the rabbi was a scholar, he could basically demonstrate, what the original words actually were and how the quote unquote translations are actually interpretations. And he knew Richard. He knows Richard Elliott Friedman. He's still with us, and he would always, caution me about being too much in awe of him because he knew him and he wasn't perfect. However, whenever we talked about these questions of words in Hebrew and interpretation versus translation, I'd say 99 out of 100 times, Richard Elliott Friedman got it right. He used the basic translation from the Hebrew, and that Hebrew is extremely repetitive. And a lot of translators feel that that's a flaw, a literary flaw. So they vary the words where Friedman never does that. So you get more of a sense reading his translation of what's actually written in the Torah.
Yeah, it's characteristic of older languages, particularly in the Near East. They tolerate repetition much more than modern. If you listen to a modern American editor, English editor, using the same word multiple times in the same passage is a big no-no. But it's done all the time in ancient languages, and even in Arab novels of the present day. In the dialogue, he uttered, he said, he repeated. English will all just a matter of style. They'll deliberately just change the word because they thought repetition induces boredom. But if you look in an Arabic novel, it's always he said, she said, he said, she said, all the way down the same verb. And that, it's also in the modern cultures just vary.
Also, it's the difference between verbal and written cultures.
Yeah, true.
Right. In verbal culture, repetition is an aid to memorization.
Very much so. That's why poetry is always earlier than prose in a culture, because you need rhyme and rhythm. It's much easier to memorize large amounts of material for oral recitation if it's poetic. Prose is much more difficult.
Though early Hebrew poetry in the Bible has neither rhyme nor meter.
No.
I mean, I've asked that question repeatedly. How do you recognize when something in the Torah is a poem? If it doesn't have rhyme and it doesn't have meter.
It's uncertain, but you do have, each line has two pieces with the caesura in the middle. And there's frequent frequent use of synonyms in Hebrew poetry. They'll say the same thing with different words. That's how you recognize it. But the boundaries between poetry and prose in the Hebrew Bible can be very uncertain, which is, you see a Bible in English, which will, make a claim and separate what they think is the poetry out into a stanza with an indentation, and there's no clear indication that's not there in the Hebrew Bible.
Sometimes they help you out, like when they tell you that Miriam sang this song, after they crossed the Red Sea, so they're kind of enclosing it in brackets.
It sounds poetic. I did a lot of Hebrew a long time ago, so. But no, it's true. There is poetry in the Hebrew Bible. People just aren't exactly sure of the boundaries frequently.
I'm gonna leave now, John. Once again, thanks so much for this.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
I'm glad you liked it.
And I'll see all you guys soon.